Hello everyone, welcome to Vistas Learning. I am Prithviraj and I would like to take you through the making of global world in this unit. In India, and as in many other colonies, the growth of modern nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement. People began discovering their unity in the process of the struggle with colonialism. The sense of being oppressed under colonialism provided a shared bond that tied many different groups together. The Congress under Mahatma Gandhi tried to forge these groups together within one movement, but the unity did not emerge without conflict. The name Silk Routes points to the importance of westbound Chinese silk cargoes. Along with this route, historians have identified several silk routes over the land and by the sea, knitting together vast regions of Asia and linking Asia with Europe and Northern Africa. They are known to have existed since before the Christian era and thrived almost till the 15th century. But Chinese pottery also traveled the same route, as did textiles and spices from India and Southeast Asia. In return, precious metals, gold and silver, flowed from Europe to Asia. Food offers many examples of long-distance cultural exchange. Traders and travelers introduced new crops to the lands they traveled. Take the example of spaghetti and noodles. It is believed that noodles traveled west from China to become spaghetti. Precious metals, particularly silver, from mines located in present-day Peru and Mexico also enhance Europe's wealth and finance its trade with Asia. Legends spread in 17th century Europe about South America's fabled wealth. Many expeditions set off in search of El Dorado, the fabled city of gold. Until the 19th century, poverty and hunger were common in Europe. Cities were crowded and deadly diseases were widespread. Religious conflicts were common and religious dissenters were persecuted. Thousands therefore fled Europe for America. Economists identify three types of movement or flows within the international economic exchanges. The first is the flow of trade, which in the 19th century referred largely to trade in goods, example, cloth or wheat. The second is the flow of labor, the migration of people in search of employment. And the third is the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investment over long distances. Population growth from the 18th century had increased the demand for food grains in Britain. As urban centers expanded and industry grew, their demand for agricultural products went up, pushing up the food grain prices. Under pressure from landed groups, the government also restricted the import of corn. The laws allowing the government to do this were commonly known as the Corn Laws. Unhappy with the high food prices, industrialists and urban dwellers forced the abolition of the Corn Laws. By 1890, a global agricultural economy had taken the shape, accompanied by complex changes in labor movement, patterns, capital flows, ecologies, and technology. Food no longer came from a nearby village or town, but from thousands of miles away. In Africa, in the 1890s, a fast-spreading disease of cattle plague or rinderpest had a terrifying impact on people's livelihoods and the local economy. This is a good example of the widespread European imperial impact on colonized societies. Rinderpaste arrived in Africa in the late 1880s. It was carried by infected cattle imported from British Asia to feed the Italian soldiers invading in East Africa. Entering Africa in the east, rinderpest moved west like forest fire, reaching Africa's Atlantic coast in 1892. The example of indentured labor migration from India also illustrates the two-sided nature of the 19th century world. Indentured labor, a bonded laborer under the contract to work for an employer for a specific amount of time to pay off his passage to a new country or a home. Do you know who are Shikaripuri Shroffs and Nattukotai Chettiars? They were amongst the many groups of bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia using either their own funds or those borrowed from European banks. They had a sophisticated system to transfer money over large distances and even developed indigenous forms of corporate organization. Over the 19th century, British manufacturers flooded the Indian market. Food grains and raw material exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. One important feature of the US economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s, it became a characteristic feature of industrial production in the US. A well-known pioneer of mass production was the car manufacturer Henry Ford. He adapted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse in which slaughtered animals were picked apart by the butchers as they came down in a conveyor belt, to his new car plant in Detroit. He realized that the assembly line method would allow a faster and a cheaper way of producing vehicles. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. This was a way of increasing the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. Standing in front of a conveyor belt, no worker could afford to delay the motions, take a break, or even have a friendly word with a workmate. As a result, Henry Ford's car came off the assembly line at 3-minute intervals, a speed much faster than that achieved by previous methods. The T-model Ford was the world's first mass-produced car. The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid of 1930s. During this period, most part of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. First, agricultural overproduction remained a problem. This was made worse by falling agricultural prices. Second, in the mid-1920s, many countries financed their investments through loans from the US. While it was often extremely easy to raise loans in the US when the going was good, US overseas lenders panicked at the first sign of the trouble. The Second World War broke out a mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was fought between the Axis powers, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the Allies, Britain, France, and Soviet Union, and the US. It was a war waged over 6 years on many fronts, in many places, over land, on the sea, in the air. The war caused an immense amount of economic devastation and social disruption. Reconstruction promised to be long and difficult. Two crucial influences shaped post-war reconstruction. The first was the US emergence as the dominant economic, political, and military power in the Western world. The second was the dominance of Soviet Union. First, an industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. But to ensure mass consumption, there was a need for high and stable incomes. Incomes could not be stable if employment was unstable. Thus, stable incomes also required steady, full employment. The second lesson related to a country's economic links with the outside world. The goal of a full employment could only be achieved if governments had power to control flows of goods, capital, and labor. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund, in short IMF, to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as World Bank, was set up to finance post-war reconstruction. The IMF and the World Bank are referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, or sometimes the Bretton Woods twins. The post-war international economic system is also often described as Bretton Woods system. The IMF and the World Bank commenced financial operations in 1947. Decision-making in these institutions is controlled by the Western industrial powers. The US has an effective right of veto over key IMF and World Bank decisions. The international monetary system is the system linking national currencies and monetary system. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates. From the 1960s, the rising cost of its overseas involvements weakened the US finances and competitive strength. The US dollar now no longer commanded confidence as the world's principal currency. It could not maintain its value in relation to gold. This eventually led to the collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates and the introduction of a system of floating exchange rates. The industrial world was also hit by unemployment that began rising from the mid-1970s and remained high till the early 1990s. From the late 1970s, MNCs also began to shift production operations to low-wage Asian countries. Question number 1. Westbound Chinese silk cargoes were transported through? Answer: Silk Route. Question number 2. What does one mean by El Dorado? Answer: City of Gold. Question number 3. What does indentured labor means? Answer: bonded laborer or slaves. Question number 4. Name the bankers and traders who financed export agriculture in Central and Southeast Asia. Answer: Shikaripuri Shroffs and Nattukotai Chettiars. Question number 5. The IMF and the World Bank commenced financial operations in which year? Answer: 1947. With this, we come to an end of this unit. I hope all of you have remembered Silk Route, El Dorado, indentured labor, IMF, and World Bank. For such informative videos, keep watching Vistas Learning.